Are we antinomian? Are we lawless? No, we're not. Again, keep reading in the book. He said we're not to get away with sin. Look at Galatians chapter 5. But we do it because of a love relationship with God. What is the first and greatest commandment? It is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Hello and welcome to Reasoning Through the Bible. My name's Glenn and I'm here with Steve. If you have your copy of the Bible, open it to Galatians chapter 3, verse 10. And we've been working our way through Galatians where Paul makes a very strong, very repetitive case for that we are justified before God by faith, that it is faith that justifies us and it is not of works. And one of the reasons for that is what we stopped with last time. So I want to pick up right where we left off last time and read for you Galatians 3:10. It says this, "For as many as are of the works of the law are under a curse, for it is written, cursed is everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law to perform them." Steve, I wanted to spend a minute just talking about this because I think right here is the crux of the misunderstanding that many, if not most of the modern people that want to put us back under the law, they don't grasp this point right here in Galatians 3:10. So who in this, according to this verse, who is it that's cursed?
It's the ones who are trying to perform all the things of the law. Those are the ones who are cursed. And it's very obvious that they're cursed because nobody can perform all things, all of those 613 laws, and keep them for all of your life. It's impossible to do that. That's why it's a curse. And those are the ones that are trying to live up to the standards of those laws to achieve righteousness before God.
What he's saying here is categorical. Everyone who does not keep all things in the law. And he's quoting Deuteronomy chapter 27, which is towards the end of when the law was given. And so it's summing up, after he had given all of the things in the Mosaic law, he says, you have to keep all of it. Everyone has to keep all of it. So the reason I bring this up here is because I've heard several people over the years tell us as Christians that we're still obligated to keep the Mosaic law. And so I wanted to stop and say, okay, what does that really mean? Okay, and we touched on it a couple of sessions ago, at least on one of the sessions. One is, if we look at the Mosaic law in the Old Testament, there was more generations without the law than there was generations with the law. There were more years and generations from Adam to Moses than there was between Moses and Jesus. So the Old Testament, a smaller number of years with a smaller number of generations were under the Mosaic law than ones that were not under it. So that's the first kind of misunderstanding. Secondly, people really don't get what it means when it says here, everyone has to keep all of it. What they end up doing is picking and choosing. And there's a story that I've told this story before. I had a guy at my church one time who was a post-millennialist, and he was really big on keeping the law. And God bless the post-millennialists. They're really socially active, as Christians should be, and they're really focused on changing society and evangelism and things like that, and getting involved in social causes, and God bless them for that. But this one guy kept on and on about how we have to keep the law. And we're still under the law. And he would look at me and say, well, you're not antinomian, are you? Antinomian means without law. He says, you're not lawless. You're not antinomian, are you? You believe you can just go whatever your flesh wants to do? Well, no. Well, then we have to keep the law. And they made divisions between the ceremonial parts of the law, such as the sacrifices and the priestly orders and things like that. He said, well, that's fulfilled in Jesus, but the moral parts of the law we're still obligated for. So I finally got tired of listening to him, to be perfectly honest. And I finally pulled him aside one day and I said, look, first of all, the Old Testament law, yes, we can look and say that there's some of this is for the ceremonial part and the moral part, but all those laws aren't divided like that. There's not a clear delineation once you get down in the weeds. Secondly, if you're saying you have to keep the moral parts of the law, then Galatians 3:10, you have to keep all of it. You can't pick and choose. So let's just look at some of this. So first of all, one of the things it says is that you can't plow your fields every seventh day or work every seventh day, but it also says you can't plant food every seventh year. Every seventh year, you're supposed to not plow the fields and let any old buddy come in and get anything wild that's grown in your field. So if you're going to be consistent, and if you're a farmer and you've grown food or grown hay or grown cattle over the last 6 years, right now, this minute, you have to stop working your field and not harvest it for the next year. You have to take the next year off. And oh yeah, by the way, let anybody in town come in and take whatever they want out of your field. That's what the law says. And matter of fact, Israel didn't do it either, which is why they spent 70 years in Babylonian captivity. God told them that you didn't keep my Sabbath years for letting the land rest, so the land is going to get its rest. And so we're still obligated for that. Secondly, there's things like mixed fabric clothing that you need to go home right now and throw away anything in your closet that's of mixed fabric. And there's a very, very important law that says that a husband dies, then his widow needs to marry the deceased husband's brother. And if they don't do that, if the brother refuses to marry his brother's widow, then the widow is supposed to bring him before the congregation, take off her sandal, and spit on him. I mean, that's what it says. And declare him to be such and so. And so I said, you've been reading, this guy in my church, I said, you've been reading all these books from these guys that's telling you this. What's the answer? You're not keeping all of it. What say you? And he says, well, I don't know, but I'll find out. And he went home over the next week and he called the guy. And if it's the guy that published all these books, if I mentioned his name, there's people out there that know who I'm talking about. He called the guy that was writing the books, that was saying all this. And I saw him a week later and I said, well, what'd he say? And he said, well, you got to be reasonable. Now, Steve, is it okay, according to Galatians 3:10? Oh, just be reasonable.
That story never gets old with me. I always get a chuckle out of it. A couple of notations. One, he said, okay, yes, Jesus fulfilled those laws, but we got to keep these other laws. Well, now you have to have somebody who's going to be the arbitrator that's going to decide which ones Jesus fulfilled, which ones that you still have to keep. That you start bringing somebody, man, into it to make that decision, which was apparently what this author of the book was doing. Another thing is on the sabbatical rest, there's a whole denomination that has built themselves around keeping the Sabbath on the seventh day. But do they then carry that out to every seventh year, take a rest? You mentioned how it would work if you're a farmer. How do you transfer that to somebody that works in an industry somewhere? Well, you would transfer it to say every 7 years, you got to take off from work. Do they do that? No, they don't. Why? Well, because you got to be reasonable. That's why it's so funny. People can't keep all these laws. That's why they're under a curse. Last thing I want to mention is that verse 10, Paul says they're cursed for everyone who does not abide by all things, all of the laws. So this argument that Jesus fulfilled some of them, but other ones we still have to keep, everything we've mentioned, not what Paul's saying. Paul's saying, You got to keep all of them. And if you don't keep all of them, you're under a curse. That's what the law brings to people.
And the reason Paul was saying you have to keep all of them in Galatians 3:10 is because he's quoting Deuteronomy 27 that says you have to keep all of them. And there's nowhere in the Old Testament law or the New Testament that says, oh, just be reasonable and interpret it the way you think it ought to be and leave out the parts that you think are a little cumbersome. Well, no. Again, cursed is everyone who doesn't keep all of it. That's what the inspired word of God says in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Steve, I heard a sermon last week that was online. And again, if I mention the guy's name, a lot of people know who I'm talking about. His entire sermon was how, we're obligated to be under the law in the New Testament church. And he went through several passages. And I'd like to just go through some of those and explain how these people are saying we have to be under the law, but they're ignoring Galatians 3:10. You have to keep all of it. For example, one of the things that he said was, okay, there is a law about paying workers. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 14 and 15 say that you should pay workers and you have to give them what you owe them. And this sermon I heard says, that's a good principle. If you're an employer, you're not supposed to cheat workers. If they work it, you're supposed to give them their wages. You're supposed to be fair. And I agree. If we are today, and if we're not doing that, it's a sin. But wait a minute. Cursed is everyone who doesn't keep all of it. What does Deuteronomy 24, verse 14 and 15 actually say? You can't just go in and take it as a principle and reinterpret it for what I want it to say. No, you have to keep what it actually says. And what it actually says is, you shall give him his wages on his day before the sun sets, so that he will not cry against you and the Lord become a sin against you. So it's saying in Deuteronomy, the law was pay your workers before the sun goes down that day. Now, what would happen if every company in the world had to do payroll every day? It's just not a practical thing in a modern world, at least with modern things. But the Old Testament law says the point of the law was so you wouldn't wait a week or two to pay him. That was the whole point of Deuteronomy 24 was, don't wait a week or two, pay him today. He works today, pay him today. And so we can't reinterpret that for hours. Another one that this gentleman said in his sermon was, there's an Old Testament law that says if you have the roof of your house, you're supposed to put a parapet, which is a guardrail, around the roof. And this gentleman said, well, see, we don't have flat roofs for the most part. People had guardrails around the flat roof so people wouldn't fall off or things wouldn't fall off on them down in the street. And so it protected people from injury because of your property that might be not well maintained. And so the principle is there of maintain your property and don't set things up to where people are going to come along and innocently get hurt. Well, I agree. We should do that. In fact, there's laws about that on the books in most countries. But wait a minute. What does Galatians 3:10 say, Steve?
It says you've got to keep all the parts of the law. It doesn't say you got to keep all the principles of the law. It says you got to keep all parts of the law.
It says keep all the law. Put a guardrail around the roof. And if you don't do that, you're in violation of the law. It doesn't say, oh, here's a principle, go interpret that to mean what you want it to mean and ignore the part you don't want it to mean. No. I mean, this is the exact reason why there's a place in the Old Testament where a good Jewish man was not supposed to cut the corners of their head. And so you'll see, or many Orthodox Jews will have little ringlets of hair on the corners of their head. And put this on the frontispiece of your mind. So they'll have a phylactery on their head. How literal are you going to be? How figurative are you going to be? It just goes on. The taking care of widows was there. The one I mentioned was so that you wouldn't have poor widows that are out there that are like single moms with no means of support. And if we were to implement that today, Steve, it would cut against polygamy laws that are in many, if not most countries. The Old Testament didn't have polygamy laws. And in fact, it commanded a form of polygamy. Nowhere in there does it say don't marry her if you're already married. No, it said you're supposed to marry her and raise up children so that the family, the land would stay in the inheritance. So the people today that want us back under the law are just ignoring what the law says, and they're pulling principles out of it to apply here to make them feel good. Are we antinomian? Are we lawless? No, we're not. Again, keep reading in the book. He said we're not to get away with sin. Look at Galatians chapter 5. But we do it because of a love relationship with God. What is the first and greatest commandment? It is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. That is the law of Christ that's mentioned several times in the New Testament. Are we under a law? Yes, we're under the law of Christ. And the law of Christ is what keeps us from sinning and keeps us loving our neighbor. But if we're under the law, cursed is everyone who doesn't keep everything in the law. And why people can get away with it today by just throwing out things like that man I knew in church, I don't think he really read all of the law. And he just sort of thought it was a good idea.
This is what Paul understood about going back under the law from these Judaizers that had come in. The gentleman that you had at your church, he was relying on the interpretation of the person that was writing the book. The pastor that you were talking about in his sermon, his congregants were relying on his interpretation of the principles. I saw an interview earlier this week of a believing Jew interviewing a non-believing Jew. And in that conversation, the non-believing Jew said, well, we can't really understand how to keep the 613 Mosaic laws, the Torah, so we have to rely on the oral tradition, the Tanakh, which has the interpretation of a group of rabbis on how to adhere to the actual laws. This is what Paul understands in legalism. When you're going underneath it, you're now being pulled back under other people that are interpreting the law. It's not just the law itself. He uses that as an example. You got to keep all aspects of the law, the 613, but what the people want to add to it is the oral tradition. I've mentioned several times, this was the main rub between Jesus and the ruling class, the Pharisees and Sadducees, were the extra burden that they had put on the people of their oral laws to interpret the 613. So the people were always under the burden of not just the 613 laws, but the interpretation of them in this oral tradition. This is why Paul is seeing this, I think, Glenn, as a beachhead is what we would take it. This is a dangerous point for these Gentile believers and even maybe the Jewish believers that are there, of the people coming back in and saying, no, you've got to add the Jewish law back into it. And Paul is so passionate. That's why he said earlier, I'm so amazed that you have abandoned the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Messiah.
If we don't keep the entire law, then we're guilty of breaking the law. It's a chain. If you can't say, well, I only broke one link in the chain. Well, you broke the chain. If you broke one link, you broke the chain. And the pull of the flesh to try to be legalistic is strong. We have a strong pull from the flesh to try to be legalistic. And this is where people say, oh, you're supposed to wear these kind of clothes and you can only do this and can't do that. And it gets to be this huge burden. Remember in Acts chapter 15, where the people started out with one thing saying, just circumcised, and then it was circumcised and keep the law. which meant all these volumes of traditions. And towards the end of that church council in Acts 15, the apostle stood up and says, brothers, neither we nor our fathers could keep this. So why are we laying it on the Gentiles when they won't be able to keep it either? That's what the scripture teaches. Remember Jesus, the Pharisees, they were very focused on keeping the law. And what did he tell them? You tithe your spices, your mint and your cumin, but you ignore the big things of the law. He says, you should do this and keep the weightier things of the law. He didn't let them off saying, oh, it's okay to ignore tithing the little bit of spice I might have growing outside my kitchen window. No, you got to tithe that too. He never gave an inch on keeping all of the law. And the law then becomes this burden of keeping it, having to tithe the little bit of spice I have in my garden, and how much is work, and when does work stop? When I pick something up out of your hand, am I working or are you working? Do I have to hand it? How far can I walk on a Sabbath day before it comes into work? And all these rules. And no, the Sabbath was made for our benefit. We weren't made in order to work to have to keep all these rules.
We're using the examples here of the Jewish law because that's what Paul is referencing here and he's dealing with, but it transfers over to the Gentile people and the things that are part of the legalism in our world today as we are recording this session. You got to wear your hair a certain way. You got to wear your dress a certain way. You have to wear certain clothes. Jesus, it leads to prideful things. Jesus said, don't stand on the corner praying like the leadership does so that everybody can see them praying. Go into your closet and pray. It's not just these laws from the Jewish Mosaic law that were in the oral tradition that we're talking about. We're talking about the legalistic things from other denominations, all denominations, I would say, that come in and get in the way between belief and faith in Jesus Christ and faith alone. That's what we're also trying to get across here. But if you're falling under a legalistic portion from somebody that is making interpretations, Paul is saying you don't have to have that burden on you, that you can be unburdened by it by going back and realizing it's faith and faith alone. And so that's what Paul is talking about. And that's why we're spending so much time on this, because it's still relevant to Gentile people that are not under the Jewish law.
The next verses in Galatians 3 are 11 and 12, which say this: now that no one is justified by the law before God is evident, for the righteous man shall live by faith. However, the law is not of faith. On the contrary, he who practices them shall live by them. So in those two verses, what he's saying there is the righteous must live by it. If you're going to be righteous by the law, you have to live by the law. He had just said you have to do all of it. And now in 11 and 12, he says you have to actually just do it. You can't just agree with it. You have to actually do all of the things in the law, every bit of it. The righteous has to be righteous according to this law, which he says the law is not of faith. You can't do that. The righteous must live by faith because the law is not of faith. Here's the question though, Steve. Therefore, if we want to be righteous, can we be righteous by law keeping, or is it by faith?
By faith. It's very clear that that's what Paul is talking about. We're only found righteous by faith, meaning that through that faith, God declares us as being righteous. So again, I want to be clear on this. It's God doing the declaring. It's not just us believing that by faith that we're going to be righteous. God declares the righteousness. So it's not something that we're earning. Expressing faith is not a work in and of itself.
Notice also what it's saying there is in the original Greek, there is no definite article, the. It's not saying, at least in verse 11. It's not saying the law, it's saying law. No one is justified by law. He's talking about law in general. Any moral law, any obligation, any command of God. We are not justified before God, according to Galatians 3:11, by obeying commands of God. He says this over and over in this passage. Steve, is there another way to be justified before God according to Galatians 3:11 other than by faith?
In verse 12, it says the person who practices the law has to live by that law. He's trapped. He's trapped by the law, by the one who practices it. Paul is making it clear here that faith is the only way.
Let's look at verse 12 again. At the end of verse 12, it says, he who practices them shall live by them. If you're going to say that we're justified before God by obeying the commands of God, by obeying this moral code that he gives us, then you have to successfully live by the commands of God. And you have to live by Jesus' divine interpretation of those commands given in the Sermon on the Mount. If you look at a woman, you're guilty of adultery. Call somebody a fool, you're guilty. And so this is why he's saying no one can do this. In the next verse, verse 13, it says, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law. Well, Steve, why is the law a curse?
Because people can't adhere to it. They're going to fail at some point. They're going to miss one of them. This just takes one. So that's why it's a curse, because you can't keep all of them. There's no way.
How about just top 10? We can make a top 10 list of the 10 commandments. Can we keep the 10 commandments? At least we could do that. We could earn our way, or at least maintain our salvation after we get it. And so if I keep the 10 commandments, can I maintain my justification before God?
I was going to say we do have a top 10 list that is the 10 commandments. No. And look, there's nobody out there that's even, I want to say, have even kept all 10 of those commandments day after day after day throughout their whole life.
1 John 1 says that if we say that we have no sin, we are a liar. And because we have sin. Now, I'm too nice of a guy to say that, but God says that we are all sinning. We've all broken the law. We all continue to break the law. So therefore, we can't live by it. That's the point here in this whole chapter. He keeps quoting these Old Testament verses, these Old Testament passages, saying, even back in the Old Testament, you had to keep all of it. You couldn't just pick and choose. It's a curse because you can't even keep the 10 commandments. We are all under this curse. The more we try to really live by it, the more we realize that we've failed. The idea of keeping the law in order to be righteous before God is seducing. It's a harlot that is seducing us, because as Christians, we want to be righteous. We have commands. We're going to get to them before we get out of this book. Strong commands, do not sin. And he lists off exactly what we're not supposed to do as New Testament Christians. So the teaching, though, that we can come up with a list of do's and don'ts and behaviors that makes us right before God or maintains our righteousness before God is so seducing. The problem is we can never be obedient enough. We can't even keep those 600 plus that are in writing, let alone Jesus' interpretation of it. That's why it talks about the law of liberty in the book of Galatians. We are set free from the law of sin and death. We're under the law of Christ, which is love God with all our heart and our neighbor as ourselves. And if we do that, then we can be free in Christ. We don't have a ball and chain in the prison of trying to keep rules. We'll stop here for today because we're out of time, but we're still not finished with Galatians. We're still reasoning our way through. And so we trust that you'll be back here with us next time as we continue to reason through this very rich passage.
Thank you so much for watching and listening. As always, may God bless you.